the car is becoming a kind of symbol of human progress. Whether or not it's a French car or an Italian car, to the people on the ground, they're seeing something incredible. Vehicles that set off in Beijing have now made it thousands of miles, something which seemed impossible before they set off.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and greetings to all of you listening from places like Nantucket, Massachusetts, Janesville, Wisconsin, Everett, Washington, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, Tormina, New South Wales, Australia, and Bristol, England. Thanks for joining me once again, and right now I'm coming to you from Northern California as we kick off Monterey Car Week 2024. It's going to be wall-to-wall with amazing machines, old and new, and spectacular events like the Rolex Monterey Motorsports Reunion at Laguna Seca Raceway, the Quail a Motorsports Gathering, and the big auctions like Gooding and Bonhams, all of it culminating on Sunday with the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. I'll be sharing the action all week on Instagram, so you can check that out, and you can look for more coverage of Monterey Car Week on the YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Should be lots of fun. And today's podcast episode is fitting because it goes back to the very beginning of our passion for motorized transport. Those early enthusiasts were known as automobilists, and for them it wasn't as simple as hopping in and turning the key. A few examples: merely starting a motor car could be a complex set of operations. They had to wear special garb to protect themselves from dust and rain and oil spray, and of course all the elements of the weather. They often traveled on rutted two tracks that could loosely be described as roads, at least as we know them today, and their machines were cantankerous and prone to failure. So the automobilists either had to know how to repair their contraptions themselves or bring a mechanic along, at least when they were traveling any great distance. So considering all that, you can imagine that a long overland journey in the early 1900s required bravery as well as a small fortune. My guest today has written a wonderful account of the first great automotive rally in history. Kassia St. Clair is the author of The Race to the Future, 8,000 Miles to Paris, the adventure that accelerated the 20th century. And it's all about the 1907 Peking to Paris Motor Challenge. It's a fascinating glimpse into a world that has long since vanished. And it's so interesting because some things are familiar and yet so much has changed. You know, Peking to Paris was like something out of a Jules Verne novel. The automobile and other technological innovations were colliding with cultures that had changed little over the centuries. There was also the backdrop of major political changes, and Kassia weaves it all together so nicely. It's quite an odyssey, as you'll see, and that's coming up right after this. Hi guys, Maurice Merrick here, and I want to let you know about 3 great scale models available right now at modelcitizendiecast.com. First, there's the pocket-size Lancia Stratos HF Stradale in 1/64th scale by Mini GT. Or how about a BMW 3.0 CS Coupe in 1/43rd scale by Mini Champs in your choice of 3 different colors. Or if American muscle is more your style, how about the 1968 Shelby GT500 convertible in great big 1/18th scale by Acme Trading Company. It's finished in Acapulco blue with white racing stripes, and boy oh boy, check out those mag wheels. You can find all of these and more at modelcitizendiecast.com. Use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout and get 10% off your order. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Kassia, I have to tell you, this was a great summer read. And my copy of the book has, I think, grains of beach sand in it, a little sunscreen on some of the pages, and the binding is starting to go. So I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I kind of beat the book up. But luckily, the dust jacket was left at home, so it's in perfect condition. No one is the wiser when it goes onto this shelf.
Oh, well, that's the sign of a well-read book, so I don't mind at all. Sunscreen and sand, that's perfect.
Well read, absolutely. The Race to the Future, 8,000 Miles to Paris. The Adventure that Accelerated the 20th Century. And we're talking about, of course, the 1907 Peking to Paris automobile race. This is your third book, right?
Yes. So my first two books, the first one was The Secret Lives of Colour, which came out in the UK in 2016 and I think in the US in 2017. And then the second one was The Golden Thread that came out a couple of years later and was a history of textiles from sort of the very first fibres that we know human beings ever touched right up to what they're cooking up for when they imagine we'll all be travelling to Mars.
So a book about color, a book about textiles, and now a book about this now obscure event. Quite an eclectic selection of topics.
Yeah, I do have to admit that my agent and my editor were a little bit nervous because I guess, color and textiles, there's a commonality there. But for them, they were concerned about the leap to as you say, a now pretty obscure automobile race that took place in 1907. For me, there is a link. I guess the subjects that really attract me are topics that help reveal truths about our everyday life, but are, that they often topics that are so everyday that we've stopped even thinking about them, and we don't even pause to consider whether or not they have a story or history. That's certainly true of colour. It's most definitely true of textiles, and it's also really true of the car. And as well as being a history of this particular race, the Race to the Future also talks about the car more generally, and a few of the kind of contextual things that were happening around 1907 that have kind of created the world in which we all live today. And so, yes, I got to tell a fantastic rip-roaring yarn about a particular journey, but it was also, a broader history. And so for me, there is a link, although it takes some explaining. So so maybe it's like the equivalent of the joke where you have to explain the punchline. I don't know.
I'm glad you said that, because interspersed between the accounts of the race, there are chapters about general topics of the time. You sort of take us back to the early 20th century. For example, you have an entire chapter on the horse as a means of work and transportation, and what that meant during the rise of cities when we were moving from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, and what that meant by the early 1900s. And it's pretty stark, some of the descriptions in there, just, the filth in the streets and the trials of the horses themselves. We're animal lovers today would be shocked by that chapter, I think. So this begins in January 1907 with a Parisian newspaper, Le Matin.
Yes.
And the publishers propose a motor car race from Peking, China to Paris. Why?
In one sense, it seems completely mad, and it seemed that way to contemporary readers. But on the other hand, it was also a kind of evolution of a kind of well-worn trail. So I'll explain what I mean by both of those things. So at the time, in 1907, automobiles were still relatively young. The very first one, that most people can agree on was Carl Benz's, Model 3 that came out in 1886. By 1907, the technology has progressed, but people still view automobiles as playthings for the wealthy that are raced around circular tracks, exactly like a racehorse. In fact, a lot of the terminology is the same, and people used to dress their drivers like jockeys with kind of coloured silk. So there was, it was seen very much as a kind of plaything. They were very expensive, and they were really unreliable. And even kind of very favourable motor car publications of the time would, give advice to drivers of, huge lists of equipment that they would need to take with them, even for a kind of, a countryside jaunt. So Le Matin had this idea that this this race would be a way of testing a new technology and putting it through its paces in a really kind of exciting way. They're a newspaper; they want to sell copies, and so if they can persuade people who are involved in the automobile industry to agree to do this incredible 8,000-mile journey, it will make great newspaper copy, but it will also expose a new technology to a really rigorous trial and would help persuade skeptics. And it sounds very odd to us today that there are people at the time, even in 1907, who were thinking, the car's not really a viable technology. But that really was the view of the time. And you can see that in the response to Le Matin's article. People just thought it was impossible. People thought it was a stupid idea. It wasn't taken very seriously. Similarly, The Economist in 1907 proclaimed the triumph of the horse. They had looked at the car and they thought, there's no way that this is going to be realistic competition for the horse, which was so firmly entrenched. But I also said that in a way that this was kind of a natural progression. And the reason why I say that is because there was a well-established history of newspapers proposing or sponsoring races, particularly, bicycle races and things like that. And there had also been some early motor car races, not quite as ambitious, but, between Paris and Madrid, for example, in 1903. So this felt like a continuation of that, much bolder in some ways, but of a piece with some of the earlier efforts that had been done that were similar.
Yeah, it was a trend of the time. There's more than one example, and it continued even into the 1920s and 30s. It was also a kind of a pet project of industrialists and wealthy barons who sort of wanted the prestige of a trophy with their name on it. Like, I'm thinking specifically of the Dewar Trophy, which you may be familiar with. The whiskey people. The Dewar Trophy was a prize for technological achievement. And Cadillac won that prize in 1908 for the standardization of their manufacturing. Just a little aside here, you may be interested to know. They disassembled every car that had entered that year from different manufacturers, and they put all the parts in a pile, and then they added parts from, crates. So in other words, they had all these different parts mixed up, and the objective was put it back together, not knowing which parts came from where. If they all fit together, they're standardized. And Cadillac won. From that day, their slogan became standard of the world. So there are many examples of this. Le Matin is a morning paper, so the idea is Parisians wake up, have their coffee, and read the latest dispatches from the Far East. And, of course, as you say, the task seems impossible. But France is the world's leading car manufacturer, and that is very significant. Also significant is an incredible sense of national pride in those days, which seems a little bit alien to us now in a global society, right, where we're so interdependent. But French national pride was incredibly strong, and the publishers wanted the tricolor to fly higher than all the others, right?
Absolutely. So, and this is partly the reason why I structured the book in the way I did with these interleaving chapters, is because so many of the things that we take for granted now, were very alien to contemporaries. And one of these things is kind of the spiritual or even kind of physical home of the automobile. In 1907, it was still arguably in the old world, and in particular in France. But they're already feeling pretty insecure about their place. And 1907 would be kind of a really pivotal year for that. The Italians were winning lots of automobile races, and Italian cars were becoming more prestigious, but also you have growing competition from America. And the following year, the first Model T will emerge from Henry Ford, and then really it could no longer really be argued that France was the center of the automotive world and the heart of the automotive world. But in 1907, there's still this possibility. And so Le Matin, which is, a proudly French newspaper, another part of this idea is that they will celebrate the prowess of the French automotive industry, and they will demonstrate it to their largely French readers. But it will also be an opportunity, because of the publicity they imagine will, and indeed does, flow from this race, of demonstrating France's automotive power to the world, a kind of way of, a sort of soft power flexing of muscles, if you will.
Besides the technology of the motor car, another technology is making this entire venture possible, which is the telegraph.
Absolutely. So telegraph was a pretty well-established technology by that time, but its geographic spread and the reach that it had was still exciting for people. The idea that you could send communication from very remote parts of the world, and it could be in people's newspapers in New York, in London, in Johannesburg the following morning, was still pretty exciting. And the route very purposefully was designed to follow the telegraph wires that stretched through Russia, through Mongolia, and into China to Peking, now Beijing, so that journalists embedded with the drivers would be able to write up reports and send them, and then they would be published in various publications. Of course, Le Matin had a journalist embedded with one of the cars, but there were also other journalists, in particular Luigi Barzini, who was writing for the Corriere della Sera, which was an Italian newspaper, and the Daily Telegraph, a British one. But in addition to this, there's also news filtering out from kind of news sources like Reuters and kind of news gathering organizations like that. And this is being spread around the world. And if you care to go to your local library and look at newspapers from 1907, there's a really good chance that there will be reports about the Peking to Paris in your local newspaper from that time. There were reports in Sydney, in rural Ohio, in Honolulu. No matter where you go, people were fascinated by this idea and were taking advantage of the power of this new communication technology. Again, something we're really familiar with now, but felt incredibly alien then.
The first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in 1858. You write that by 1875, most of the world was covered by telegraph, including the Far East and Australia. Pretty remarkable technological achievement to lay that much cable across the oceans. And we watch old movies and the characters talk about sending a cable. That's what they're talking about. Let's discuss the characters and their machines. Fascinating group. First of all, despite a lot of buzz and excitement around the paper announcing this challenge, really only 5 entries come through.
Yeah, so you have this initial real burst of excitement and energy, and lots and lots of people express interest, and it looks like there's going to be a kind of a mass participation. And for whatever reason, and I think there are a few different factors, Le Matin kind of helps throttle this interest, which seems really counterintuitive, by imposing essentially they ask all the competitors to put up quite a substantial amount of money, presumably to kind of sort the wheat from the chaff, to make sure that people who enter are really serious about it. But it's a very high amount of money. So they're sort of ensuring that a relatively small number of people can take part. Those are probably going to be people with a commercial interest. So, car manufacturers or people who are very wealthy independently. And so, as you say, only 5 cars make it to the start line in Peking. And this, again, also happens quite quickly. The idea is proposed at the very end of January 1907, and they have to get their cars to China by June. The proposed start date is June 10th. If you're thinking about shipping your vehicles, which of course was how the cars were going to be reaching China, that takes time. So there's actually a very short amount of time to plan the race, but also for the people who want to participate to get everything together and get it on ships to reach China.
Yeah, I guess there's two approaches they could have taken, right? One would be have as many entries as possible and just play a numbers game. Somebody is going to finish, right, out of, let's say, 50-odd entries, just for sake of pulling a number out of thin air. Or the approach that they took was, let's get the most serious people, the most prepared people, and ideally people with the financial means to see this through.
I think because the initial response to their proposal was so negative, and I think because there was this feeling that they were just almost embarrassing. They were going to embarrass the automotive industry. It was going to be completely opposite of what they intended. It was going to be humiliating, stupid. Cars would be stranded. I think because of that, they then, asked entrants to pay this money. And this really means that very few people can enter. But as you say, the people who enter, because they've already proven that they're pretty wealthy and have the resources, they are going to be the fittest. They are going to be able to, throw money at problems that come up in the course of their journey.
And the most prominent of these is Count Scipione Borghese, an Italian nobleman. And if anybody's ever been to Rome, the Villa Borghese was his home at the time this race took place. It's now, a national museum and filled with amazing treasures, sculpture and paintings. I was just there in April. And he's driving an Itala 3545 horsepower, which is a massive car, a truck of a car. One could compare it to the Cricklewood Bentleys made from 1919 to 1930-31 by W.O. Bentley. Just a stout, strong, beefy car.
Very beefy. So I think, again, something that seems odd to us now is there was great debate at the time about the kinds of cars that would be best suited to really hostile terrain. What you've got to remember is that the vast majority of this route, there will be no roads. There will be tracks on which, formed and used by donkeys, carts, people on foot. So you're not talking about roads or even, anything approaching roads for the majority of the route. You're talking about, virgin land. And so there was a lot of concern about the kind of vehicles that would be best suited to that. Some people argued really big, heavy cars. And some people thought, well, actually, maybe you need something lighter and more nimble that can literally be picked up and taken over obstacles. And this was a very big debate at the time. And the prince bet, on power and heft.
Right. And nothing else would really suit him. I mean, anything else was beneath Borghese. But speaking of light and nimble, that brings us to our next entry. Auguste Pons and Octave Foucault, two Frenchmen in a Cantal Moto-Tree, which is a cycle car. It's got two front wheels and one rear wheel, and the passenger rides in like a wicker seat right at the front of the car, and the driver is behind him. And it is a spindly, fragile machine.
Yeah, it's. I don't think we would really think about it as a car at all. I think we probably think about it as like a motorbike with pretensions. As you say, there's this rear wheel, and the driver's basically sitting almost on top of that with the engine between his legs. The passenger or the navigator is sitting in this wicker basket between the two front wheels. The setup is such that unless the passenger really kind of hunches down or is very short, they're going to be right in the way. They're going to be obscuring the view of the driver. And so it's a really ill thought out machine and incredibly dangerous. In fact, the nickname for the seat at the front was the mother-in-law killer at the time, because, any accident and whoever sat it at the front is just going to, hit the road, very literally.
And it wasn't uncommon at the time for early horseless carriages to have the driver behind passengers, particularly in cities. There were certain small cars that, were used as cabs and such that had that arrangement. But to go 8,000 miles in such a contraption is virtually inconceivable. By the way, don't know if you are aware of this, but in 2019 on the Peking to Paris, which is, was revived in the 90s, a couple of guys did it in a reproduction Cantal, and they made it.
Yeah, I actually spoke to them for the book, and which was really great fun. They were amazing, and in fact, the driver initially thought of taking his wife, and his wife was going to be the navigator, and she. They sort of did a test drive down to their local village, and they returned home, and she got out and she was like, "No, I will not do this. You'll have to find someone else." And so he managed to persuade one of his work colleagues, who eventually became his co-driver. But I love the idea that he put his wife in the mother-in-law killer seat, and she wasn't having it.
I mean, he gave her the option, and the ball was in her court, right? So,
yeah. And the answer was no, a very firm no.
Now, the original Cantal was only 9 horsepower. These guys who did it in 2019, I think they were running like a 45 horsepower motorcycle engine. So the original Cantal, 9 horsepower and loaded down. They had so much kit on board. Anyway, the third entry is Georges Cormier and Jean Bizac in a Didion Bouton 10 horsepower.
Yeah, so there were 2 kind of identical cars called the Dion Boutons, and these were sort of the favorites going in. They came from a well-established French brand founded by the Marquis de Dion, and he was sort of a friend of the or a patron of Le Matin newspaper, but also his cars had done pretty well in previous races and were kind of, prides of the French automotive industry. So I think, the betting man or woman going into, starting to look at the entrance, probably the smart money would have been on one of these 2 vehicles to win. They were very well established. They were kind of medium power. If the Prince's vehicle is up at 40 and the Cantal is below 10, these were kind of, I think, 12 or 13, somewhere around there. And they had proven themselves again and again. And also the drivers were fairly well known in the French automotive industry. Cormier had done, longer trips within Europe, largely within Europe. He'd done longer trips before. He was pretty well established. He had been around cars a long time. And Collignon, his kind of the driver of the other Didion Bouton, was a very sort of capable, talented mechanic who'd also been knocking around in the motoring world for quite a while. He'd actually raced motorcycles beforehand, and he was kind of known as a really gifted mechanic. So they've got a really good team. They've got sort of 2 experienced drivers on 2 Didion Boutons. So even if one breaks down, you've still got another one, and they've also got kind of Jean Bizac, who's there as the mechanic, but they've also got Collignon as one of the drivers, and he's also a very good mechanic. So that's a kind of very smart joint entry, if you will. Yeah,
Cormier and Collignon were true automobilists in the original sense of the term. They're devil-may-care, completely committed to the future of the motor car, great advocates for the technology. Mm-hmm. Now, these particular Didions that they fielded were not the only option, which is interesting to me, which goes back to the strategy of a big, heavy car versus a light, nimble car, because there were 40 horsepower DDL touring cars available, and they could have easily taken those, had more carrying capacity. So I imagine that was just, it came down to strategy in that event. Now, you mentioned Jean Bizac, the mechanic. There's a funny little vignette that you talk about in the book where his car is always the trailing car, right? Collignon seems to be leading the two cars frequently. And so Jean Bizac ends up eating dust like for thousands and thousands of miles. By the time they get like halfway through the race, he's just in a rotten mood.
I mean, as you will see from if you buy the book, and I hope you will, as you will see, there are some images, and Jean Bizac always looks in a bad mood. He's one of those people where every photograph of him sort of looks like a mugshot because he always looks grumpy. He always looks like a bit of a wrong-un. And you definitely get that impression that he was not the best tempered of people. And I can't imagine that being always in the rear vehicle, always being like the team's dust eater, as they put it, made him any cheerier.
And the fifth and final entry is a Dutch car called a Spiker. 18 horsepower touring car. Spikers are marvelous. If anyone has seen the movie from the 50s, it's a British film called Genevieve. That's about the London to Brighton run, and it's a Spiker versus, I think, a Didion, or maybe a Panhard. But anyway,
I think.
Yeah. Wonderful movie. But, the Spiker has this barrel bonnet. A very distinctive looking car. Sort of looks like an early Franklin, which is an American car, air-cooled, also had a barrel bonnet. But anyway, the Spiker is Dutch. The driver is a guy named Charles Godard. And Godard persuades Jacobus Spiker, the founder of the company, to give him a car for the race. I think he talks himself up quite a bit, right? And Spiker says, sure, let's do it. But in a slap in the face to Spiker, Godard paints the car in the French tricolor and sort of humiliating to a Dutch manufacturer. Like first thing he does is paint this car in the tricolor.
Yeah. So one of the first things he does is paint this Dutch car in the French tricolor. And, he could have gotten away with it because the Dutch flag and the French flag are pretty similar, but he's not ashamed to tell everyone, even those who might have kind of given him the benefit of doubt, that this is the French flag that he's painted this Dutch car, thereby immediately annoying his benefactor, who he's talked into giving him the car and in fact kind of lied. He tells Jacobus Spiker that there's this big prize, which there isn't. And he assures him that there's, that he's got funds, which he doesn't. So he kind of blags his way into being given a vehicle. First things he does, as you say, firstly, he paints the car in the French flag. The second thing he does is he goes to a kind of a nearby, car shop and tells them that he's been sent by the Spiker firm and that he's allowed to get all sorts of spare parts like tires and all sorts of other things that he'll need for the journey on the Spiker account. So he basically tells them, Spiker have okayed this. Can you give me all this stuff? They say, sure. They take him at his word. He's got a Spiker car after all. And then he promptly sells all these spare parts in order to be able to afford the ticket to get on the boat for himself and the car. But, he's not just content with that. Of course, his ticket is first class.
Of course. He is a textbook huckster.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. He reminds me, this is a weird reference. Only a few people will really get it. But if you've ever seen the old 60s TV show Green Acres, an American TV show, he's Mr. Haney. He's the guy who's always got an angle and is always trying to get one over on everyone around him.
We'll get right back to the show, but I want to take a moment to ask for your help. If you enjoy the podcast, then please consider supporting Horsepower Heritage with a donation. For instance, how about $1 an episode? That's just $2 a month, and that helps me continue bringing you the stories and interviews you enjoy. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. And join other fans in supporting the show with a donation. That's buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. Thanks for your support, and now back to the show.
So that's our cast of characters and the motor cars. So I said the modern age makes this possible, mainly cars and the telegraph. So they follow, the idea is leaving Peking to follow the telegraph lines. And not only does that give them a fairly certain route, but it also allows the journalists that are accompanying the race to send their dispatches back to Le Matin and Corriere della Sera. At the time, newspapers published serialized accounts of events of all types. You know, it was just as we enjoy like serialized television today, newsprint was the same. And it's this all is taking place with a backdrop of a rapidly changing world. Just a few examples. In China, there are foreign interlopers everywhere, sort of raping the Chinese countryside and economy and resources. The Boxer Rebellion is threatening the social order in China. It's the end of the Qing dynasty, which is like 1,000-year reign, right? It's coming to an end. The opium wars have taken place and are, it's still very volatile in terms of the opium trade. And then, it's not just China that has all of these overarching issues. Much of this race is going to pass through Imperial Russia. And the first Russian Revolution took place in 1905. So that's still kind of a fresh, unhealed scar, geopolitically. And there's sort of rumblings of the end of the Pax Britannica, right? World War I is not that far away. And already we're playing great power games globally. So all of these things, these big issues are surrounding this race. And I just find it fascinating the way you have laid it out. You have provided such amazing context that adds value to the core story, which is of the race.
Thank you. So I guess my previous books, for anyone who's not familiar with them, they're about color and textiles, and I'm not a very fussy writer in that I don't mind. The color book is full of 75 different colors, and you don't have to read it front to back. And the same is broadly true of the Golden Thread. You can read it chronologically in order, but you don't have to if there's something that strikes your fancy. And I sort of intended the same for this book too. There will be some people who come to it and they just want to read the story of the race, and then they can very easily skip the contextual chapters to come back to them in the future. Or if they don't want to read them, that's fine. You can just read the story of the race, or you can kind of read all the context and then come to the race, or you can read it as it's written, chapter by chapter. But it seemed to me that understanding this race and the impact that it had, and the impact that the car and this kind of great slew of changes that are all happening at around this time, this kind of confluence of events, you needed a really kind of big, packets and packets of extra contextual information. And that's a lot. Lots of people, maybe they're interested in car history, but they're not that interested in Imperial Chinese history or Imperial Russian history. But it's still really fundamental to understanding what made this journey so incredible. And so I really wanted to include the context. But like I said, if you want to skip it, you can. But I think it's really fascinating because it just so happens that this race is taking place at a time in history which is really fascinating, has big implications for our world today. You've already talked about China. For them, this was kind of really the apex of what they call the century of humiliation, which was kind of literally a century of continual defeats and
exploitation.
Exploitation, largely by foreign Western powers, and this race is just one of a kind of a number, and kind of at the apex, and they've got zero trust. Even though it seems like quite a small thing to us, just a race of 5 vehicles, the Chinese authorities are very naturally suspicious, and they're wondering about what this means for kind of, a military, what the military impact of this might be. Are kind of hordes of motor cars going to be coming from Russia down to invade Peking? So they're very concerned about this. Likewise in Russia, the drivers are suspected of being spies. There's lots of suspicion. Every bridge they come to has armed guards at each end. We historians quite often say that, the first Russian Revolution is 1905. But if you read the reports from 1907, it's very clear that there is still broad unrest, murders, arson. The country may not be undergoing revolution, but it's simmering, and it's just below a boil. So all this context makes the driver's experience and the journalist experience, very different and really exciting, I think, and really feeds into the broader story. So my feeling was that it was necessary, but I wanted to package it in such a way that people who just come to the book because they really love the 1907 Peking to Paris can feel free to skip it.
No, I think it was a very smart approach, and it's really 2 books in one if you think about it that way. You as you say, you can just read the chapters on the race, but the interwoven chapters with a wider history are just fascinating, and it really sets the stage for the next chapter of the race. A little bit more about the characters. I'll just run through this really quickly, so just give people a little thumbnail sketch. I said Borghese was an aristocrat. He's a sportsman in the classic sense. Like, he's mountain climbing, he's auto racing. He's also quite aloof, and has his nose in the air. Charles Godard, short, plump, fast talking, a hustler. Georges Cormier, he was a Parisian auto dealer. He sold Didion-Boutons, and as you say, he was a veteran of other rallies. And his colleague Victor Collignon, again, experienced automobilist. Auguste Pons, we don't know a whole lot about Pons. We do know that I think his wife was Italian, and they lived in Paris, and he was sort of I think a workaday guy. He didn't have family money, but he was a hopeful adventurer. He kind of wanted to get out and see the world and sort of break out of the everyday drudgery, I suppose. And so that's another reason why I think, he chose the Cantal. It was an affordable way to get into the race.
He was kind of an impossible dreamer, I think. He had a wife, and he had a young family when he starts this race, and you really get the sense that he's escaping. He wants to get away from that. He wants to live a life less ordinary. He wants to kind of conjure success from seemingly impossible odds. But he's also pretty fiery, and he's not afraid to apportion blame and get angry. And he does. That's
right. Absolutely. You say the Chinese were suspicious. Of course, they think, is this a reconnaissance mission for a coming invasion? And so the race begins late. They're all assembled in Peking, right? And they're in the old city, right? The old imperial city. And the word comes at the last minute that you're permitted to run this race. Now, first, the competitors all have a spirit of cooperation. There's camaraderie. There's a feeling of optimism. But that quickly evaporates.
So this is part of the problem with the fact that the race, the race was organized so last minute, and the planning phase was so short because, and things moved around. And so one day they'd say, oh, we're all going to travel together, and it's not really a race. It's more of a kind of an exploration, and we're all going to travel together as far as Berlin. Oh, no, wait. There's no rules. Whatever happens on the road is fair game. Oh no, wait, we're going to call the whole thing off because it's impossible. So you have lots and lots of different conflicting information in this very rushed planning phase. And by the time they get to Beijing, you've got you're already seeing that you're going to have clashes of personalities, clashes of preparation, clashes of ideas of what this endeavor is going to look like. And so any real consensus shatters almost immediately. They're too different. Their ideas are too different. The agreements that they've made are too flimsy, and they, simply put, they don't trust one another. And I also think from the moment they set off, it very quickly, the racing spirit takes over, and they begin to very obviously mistrust one another and compete with one another. And if it wasn't a race before, and there's kind of debate about how it was set up, it almost immediately becomes a race the second they set off.
Yeah, so much so that they're willing to sort of abandon their fellow competitors at certain points. And, some of them face a potential death, starvation, death from exposure, dehydration. I don't want to be a spoiler, but there's some dire moments. They're also, not only are they sort of battling each other, but they are battling the elements every inch of the way. The mud and the muck. You write of this yellow dust in the area of Peking that when the rain falls, it just becomes this intractable yellow sludge. They have to hire coolies, which are peasant laborers. That's a pejorative term now, but they hire gangs of coolies to pull the cars with ropes because they can't get forward along, under their own power. And the Gobi Desert, which is this vast expanse of nothingness, right, for miles and miles, they traverse this ancient trade route over dust and cobble. And then they encounter the Mongolians who, to their shock, they are not savages. They're intelligent, resourceful, and hospitable people. Amazing horsemen. There's a Mongolian warlord, I think, who sends his warriors out on horseback to greet the Itala and Borghese as they're sort of coming into the village, right? Magnificent. There's photographs of this stuff, by the way. Yeah. There are at least several hundred, if not upwards of 1,000 photographs that had documented this entire event.
It's incredibly, cinematic, and there are near brushes with death, and there is real jeopardy for the drivers. And they're also, as well as the real dangers that they face, they're also facing kind of dangers of their own making. They are very prejudiced. They had this idea that the people of Mongolia and the people of China are going to be, barbarians, barbaric, almost inhuman. And this is very much reflected in the language that they use in their own accounts. And they are, shocked to find that they encounter people who are really willing to help, who are really interested in helping them, who are, much more honest, as they start to admit, than, the average European. But that just wasn't in their mindset. And you can see them kind of struggling with this, in real time. There's a really lovely moment where the prince's vehicle comes upon an encampment in Mongolia, and one of the men sort of who's there, starts talking to them in German and says, "Do you speak German?" And they're like, "How on earth do you speak German?" And he says, "Well, there are these great sort of kind of world fairs that were taking place that around these time were very popular in the early 1900s, and there had been one a few years previously in Berlin, and the authorities had kind of asked if they could sort of have a kind of exhibition of different tribal people from around the world. And so they'd sort of shipped out a group of Mongolians, willing Mongolians, to kind of act as kind of representatives of the Mongolian people. And this man had been part of that group and had learnt to speak German. But they're really shocked by this. And it happens again and again. They constantly have their own, prejudices challenged, but they are kind of beginning to admit it, but also it heightens the danger for them, because they are overly reliant on each other's honesty and sense of fair play and their kind of spirit of brotherhood. They rely too much on that, and they are very slow to ask for help and very slow to trust the help given by local people on the ground, and very often the advice they get given and the help that they are given is really sensible, practical, and it is the only thing that makes this journey possible.
Yeah, it's almost as if they arrived in Mongolia expecting to encounter like Genghis Khan, and instead they are celebrated in the capital city, Kututka. Kututka. God, that's a hard one to say, but say that 5 times fast. And the Mongolians are, by the way, incredibly proud people, and they want to impress their visitors. They're proud of their country. They're proud of their accomplishments. So it's not unlike, it's human nature. It's just like when people come to the United States and expect to see everybody wearing cowboy hats, It's
You don't?
Yeah, right?
I was sure yours was just sitting out of shot.
It's so funny. We all have our preconceived ideas, right? Beyond Mongolia lies the Siberian frontier, and passage through Imperial Russia is by permission only. Typical of his fashion, Prince Borghese somehow has a royal warrant, right, from the Tsar, and apparently it's basically like a VIP all access card.
Yeah, so this is, Prince Borghese has quite a few advantages. He's very, very, very wealthy. He also speaks a little Russian. His wife has a Russian background, or rather his mother-in-law has a Russian background. His wife speaks a little Russian. He speaks a little Russian. So, that's a great help. But also he's from one of the most prominent families in Western Europe. So, doors open for him, and he can communicate more readily with local people. And he does communicate more readily with local people. But he's also, possibly because of the communication issue, or possibly because he's better traveled than a lot of the other drivers, he is more willing to trust local information and to take the help that is offered. So it's a little bit of both. You do have this sense that, he comes from immense privilege and his wealth is doing a lot of work for him. But I think there's also a kind of, he had traveled before, had experience of traveling, and so was less frightened and less insular and more open to help that was offered. And that stood him in really great stead. And you can see that again and again.
In Siberia, they sort of expect the roads to improve, but what they find is that some of these tracks are abandoned and overgrown, and the bridges are rotten. There's a rather harrowing experience that they have crossing a bridge. I don't want any spoilers. And they begin to follow the rail lines, which let's talk about the railroad for a moment, because the publishers of Le Matin specifically said anyone who uses a train, puts their car on a train, is disqualified. Like you have to roll on your 4 wheels or 3 wheels, as it were, in the Cantal's case. But this is a clever audible play, if you will, to use a football reference. And I'm not going to use a football reference because I got too many UK listeners. So in a way, Borghese kind of splits the baby. Like, well, there's really no road per se, but if I just ride the rails with my car, we'll make good time. And they did. And this is sort of a game changer. It allows him to really pull ahead from the Didions and the Spiker. And then the Spiker has a magneto failure. It's like one of the first real mechanical failures for any of the motor cars. And that puts Charles Goddard way behind. And then, of course, it's the height of the Russian summer by this time. And they encounter a phenomenon the Russians call Rasputitsa, right? Which means, literally, it means disagreeable travel. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I think it's a fascinating sort of local flavor to this whole thing.
Sure. So to step back and maybe go back to something that you originally said, they find that the roads are in disrepair. And this is because at the time, countries all around the world have spent the last century, more or less, investing in their railway networks. And railways, particularly between kind of major urban centres, they seem like the future of travel. And roads seem really old-fashioned. Roads are what you put horses and carriages down. They're not really kind of modern. And so Russia had really kind of largely seen roads as a bit pointless and a bit old-fashioned, had stopped investing in them, and had invested in the railways instead. And so the roads are in a terrible state of repair, disrepair. And then it just so happens that the weather in the summer of 1907 is dreadful, unseasonably wet. So usually this kind of season of disagreeable travel is more of a kind of spring or autumn phenomenon. But this year, it's been, this particular year in 1907, it's just been unrelenting rain. And this is kind of adding to the woes of the people. The Russian people have, have freshly emerged from a real crisis, the 1905 revolution. There's still a lot of discontent. Ordinary people, the peasantry, as they were called then, are really kind of in semi-revolt. Lots of estates kind of belonging to the landed gentry are being burnt down. And there's real fear about crop failure and famine, which is a near yearly phenomenon in Russia at the time. Ordinary people starving to death and having to go, leave the places where they were born, the villages where they were born, and move to cities simply in order to get jobs in factories in order to survive. So it's a really difficult time. And this terrible summer, which very much affects the progress of the drivers, also is adding to this kind of ominous sense of broader discontent and disaster for Russia and the Russian Empire and the ordinary Russian people.
Yeah, and the country that they're traveling through, the land they're traveling through is taiga. Taiga covers 10% of the Earth's surface. It's pine and spruce forest and plains and wetland marsh. And so if you think of the vast wilderness of Russia, Siberia, that's what we're talking about. On the ground, it's a soupy mix of black mud and tufts of grass and centuries of dead biomass, right, that have accumulated. In the wintertime, it's passable because it's frozen and covered in snow. But as you say, in the springtime, it's a total mess. Late summer, it usually dries out, but that's not the case in 1907. So they're plodding onward through this very difficult, it's like inches at a time. Meanwhile, the narrative that the publishers of Le Matin had hoped for has not really materialized like they wished. Reporters' telegrams sometimes go silent for days. And then, to their horror, an Italian car is ahead, right? Not a French one. Jacobus Spiker declares publicly that Godard is a con artist who deceived him. And so now there's this air of scandal in a sense, at least in one aspect. But then something remarkable happens. The newspapers around the world start to take notice, and they begin to paint a heroic picture of the endeavor. They sort of recast the whole thing. It's as if the local reporters see these dispatches over the wire and decide, what, I'm going to sort of embellish and make this my own story. And so many papers worldwide are now following it. And the notoriety of the entire race just explodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So as they progress, because the whole endeavor at first, when it was first proposed, had seemed, literally incredible, the fact that they've now, accomplished, day by day are accomplishing this journey, suddenly the idea of the car, as this triumphal Western modern technology conquering nature, conquering the land, suddenly begins to seem more real. And that's the story that begins to be told. And people all over the world begin to follow the story and become invested. And also as they travel through towns and cities, particularly better connected ones that have, telegraph systems, crowds start to gather, and they are greeted by people who know of their arrival before they've arrived. And so they have this very strange experience. They're having a pretty rough time day by day as they go along, and then they'll reach a city like Moscow or Nizhny Novgorod, and they'll be welcomed like heroes. And it must have been an incredibly unsettling experience for the drivers and for those taking part.
This still happens to this day for when someone decides to go on a long expedition in their car through many countries. The locals end up treating that person like, sort of a celebrity. I interviewed a Frenchman who took his Porsche 928 around the world multiple times, and he had the same experience wherever he went. Like, the red carpet was rolled out. And it's funny that in this day and age that still happens, but the curiosity has not changed. It's natural.
But also this is kind of seen, the car is becoming, is becoming a kind of symbol of human progress.
Right.
And that's something that, whether or not it's a French car or an Italian car, to the people on the ground, they're seeing something incredible. It's like it's like a proto moon landing. People are just excited by the fact that, vehicles that set off in Beijing have now made it thousands of miles. Something which seemed, impossible before they set off.
And in the vast majority of cases, I would venture to say that these were the first motor cars many of these people had ever seen. So to see something moving under its own power was remarkable. It's otherworldly. As they get closer to Paris, and particularly after Moscow, things get easier. The excitement is sort of boiling over as the race ends in Paris. And I'm not going to, again, I don't want to be a spoiler, so we're going to leave it there. But I'm really interested in some aspects beyond the story. First of all, I want to talk about your research. Where did you find your sources? I imagine you probably had to do a bit of travel in order to find good primary source material.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't get to do nearly as much travel as I wanted to do. I wanted to redo the original route myself with my husband. And we took delivery of a Toyota Land Cruiser in January 2020, and then promptly were scuppered by 2 years of coronavirus. And then the birth of my daughter, and then war between Russia and Ukraine. So, the big trip has not yet happened, although I hope it will. I still hope that it will one day. But yeah, in terms of primary sources, actually, for the race itself, there's quite a lot. There's the journalists were writing contemporary news reports that were being published in the newspapers, if not every day, then, a few times a week. And not just the journalists, but also some of the drivers were writing things at the time as well. You also have the fact that a lot of them published books in the year or two after the race, and that's interesting, on its own merits. But it's also fascinating to see how they used the news reports they were writing to make the books, and you can tell a lot by what they're leaving out, what they're embellishing. They smooth over the story in order to write their books, and that is quite revealing. I was also very lucky to get in contact with lots of surviving family members of the original participants who were very generous and shared with me kind of family photo albums. Something that I found very useful was this journey from Peking to Paris had been done previously, just not by motorcar. It had been done by people, traveling on dog sled during the winter or by horse. And I was able to find some of those accounts, and that would tell me a lot about the landscape through which they were traveling, the cities they went through, from a traveler's eyes, from a traveler's perspective, which was really helpful in kind of scene setting and painting a picture. Because quite often the participants were really focused on the realities of driving the motor car, and that took up all their focus. And they weren't kind of looking up and looking round as much as I might want them to, because I'm trying to tell a broader story and kind of recreate the scene. And so, finding traveler accounts that talked about, what the cities were like through which they were passing was really helpful. And then there's all the contextual chapters, like looking at kind of horse-powered cities and what that meant, and looking at the development of the motor car, or about women drivers and kind of gender politics in the kind of very early motoring world. All these things, demanded their own set of research. And it was a long project. So I think I started first looking at this subject in 2017, and the book just came out in the UK late last year, so 2023. So it was a very long project, and the majority of that was research.
Do you have a favorite figure among the racers after writing this?
Oh, I've got two, and they're very, very different, and they are the kind of the hero and the anti-hero, although which way round, I'll lead readers to decide for themselves.
Well, it kind of flip-flops, doesn't it?
It flip-flops. So you have the prince, who is very privileged. He can throw money at the problem and solve problems, but he's also a very dedicated, conscientious sportsman, which I quite admire. But I'm someone who, when I took 5 or 6 years to write this book, and I had like my binders of primary sources, and so I feel like I have quite a lot in common with Prince Borghese. He's quite methodical. He took the challenge really seriously, and he did his homework, which I'm that person. I too like doing my homework. But then you have Charles Goddard, who is devil may care. He's a risk taker. He's a hustler, as you say, and you can't help. He's lovable. He's a lovable rogue. And you can't help but wish well for him. And he's also heroic. He is genuinely heroic in his own way in at certain points in the book. And so my loyalty is divided between them. I wanted to tell the truth and to do the story justice, and that pulls you in both directions.
Yeah, he's not a villain. He's a scoundrel, and scoundrels, by definition, you can't help but have some affection toward them. Was there a particular perspective you gained about the world then versus the world now in writing this? I mean, was there some kind of a realization or very interesting epiphany that you had?
I loved researching the way that cities operated when they were powered by horsepower. I found that fascinating to look at cities around 1900 and how that worked in practice. How people would be getting to and from their jobs, how these vast stables, multi-story stables that were kind of, transporting goods from railway stations to people's homes or to warehouses, how that worked in practice. It was really fascinating because it's really a vision of a very complete world which disappeared overnight. You have this, disruptor technology that turns up and suddenly the world of the horse is gone. But seeing how it operated in practice was fascinating to me. And also, a real jolt. I live in an old city. I live in London. It's a city that was, originally built around older transportation technologies like horses and carts. And then the car came along and the architecture and the city kind of changed to accommodate, a newcomer. And that's really fascinating. I can see that in my day-to-day life. There are some lanes in London that are not tarmacked. They still have the cobbles. The cobbles were a really good surface for horses, and tarmac's a really good surface for cars, and that's fascinating to me, and it changes how I see the design of cities.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that was one of the big takeaways for me in reading the book is, when you consider scaling the use of the horse for whatever purpose in a city, and you think of how we scaled the automobile and the internal combustion powered whatever implement in a city, and the conflicts we're seeing now, many European capitals are now banning the internal combustion engine in the central city. I think central London, right, has some sort of ban or restriction like that.
Yeah, we have a restriction. We have congestion charge, so you kind of you pay,
right.
And lots of cities are doing the same. And there's conflict there. And I grew up with the car. I grew up with car as king. I'm an 80s child. I don't know a world without the car, and I don't know London without the car. But people are renegotiating that. But these things were being negotiated in 1907, or that negotiations was beginning in 1907, and now it feels like we're in a time when we're rethinking it, when we're imagining how our world could work with less reliance on the car. And that's really interesting to me as well.
So fascinating. The book is The Race to the Future, 8,000 Miles to Paris, The Adventure That Accelerated the 20th Century. Kassia St. Clair. Kassia, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. I hope it's selling well. I have no doubt it is. And it was a fascinating read. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really hope this entertained your listeners. I really hope that they feel inspired to go and buy the book. But yeah, thank you so much for a great conversation.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. I'll see you back here Wednesday, August 28th for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.